I appreciate that.
You totally could. And like, dude, there's some big machines out here that people run. I mean, it's crazy how big these things are.
Wow, yeah. I mean, I think you showed me that one machine a while ago. Last time you were in town,
yeah,
that could literally pick up a tree and then strip it in one motion.
yeah. Those tree processors.
Yeah,
it's sick. Just yeah. So expensive. So those machines are so expensive, and totally changed how forestry is done. Just because they're so big and so fast that you just don't need nearly as many people. And it's really easy to flood the market with timber.
Oh, interesting.
So, like, for example, 1,000 board feet. So board feet is sort of the standard unit for basically boards, right? for how much your timber is worth. The price for 1,000 board feet right now is basically the same as it was 30, 40 years ago.
Wow.
I mean, which is crazy, just given how much more expensive everything is, and just cost of living, cost of machinery, healthcare. I mean, like you just have to, basically my point is you have to get out way more volume now than you used to be viable. So it's definitely changed how, I mean, but that's just sort of what markets do, right? I mean, efficiency.
Right.
So, but it's definitely really changed how things are done.
Interesting.
Anyway, you should become a heavy machinery operator. That's really what I'm getting at, John.
Yeah.
Yeah. You learn things. You learn that you can destroy things really fast when you drive machinery. That's my big takeaway from the summer I drove little machinery. Not quite just a forklift.
Yeah.
I dragged a huge skid of aluminum off one time, just dealing with the fact that I don't have a suspension system, so that when you get your fork stuck in something out on an uneven road and your wheels don't go down, now you're sort of hanging. How do you get out of that mess? Right? The right way to get out of it is dynamically, right? It's a little bit of a multivariable calculus problem, or at least put your forks down when you back up and you go back up, right? So I ruined some aluminum. One time I dropped a 55-gallon drum, if you can imagine, of adhesive, cracked it open right outside the factory floor. Truth be told, it was sort of an on-ramp we didn't necessarily need, but yeah, that was bad. So
jump God.
Out, get your coal shovel. And another time I pulled a guy dropped a whole, well, we call them hoppers. These are basically the sort of stuff that you put garbage in, and a truck comes by and lifts it up, and industrial size garbage pieces. And oftentimes people throw those into great big bins that, semis drop off, something like a, what do you call these? A shipping container with the top off, more or less. I mean, it's something like that, right? And you fill it up with your stuff. And you can, of course, when you're raising one of those things with forklifts and knocking it, having it sort of launch its stuff in there, you can imagine the momentum could, if you're not careful, carry that thing right off your forks and into the bin. Right? And now you got many, many hundreds of pounds of sheet metal, or iron, cast iron, not sheet metal, dropped in the middle of this thing, and you have to figure out how to get it out.
So oh my gosh!
Another guy I saw ripped didn't follow the rules, which are never pick up anything higher than you have to pick it up, right? Which is an MGH lesson, right? It's a little physics lesson.
Yeah.
He is not going to be your friend here.
Mm.
When if you make a mistake, and I watched a guy pick up just a 4x8 sheets of plywood, right up into an industrial strength air conditioner about 20 feet in the air. He just wasn't paying attention. He just went too high and ripped it off and just came crashing down onto the factory floor.
Jeepers, man.
Anyway, you learn to be careful and humble.
Yeah.
Hopefully you got a little more play in the woods there, John.
Yeah, I do. Mostly, yeah, it's like the machines are so big. The machine I was running, it's just this huge thing, and it's just so easy to just make a huge mess or get yourself in a bad position. Just like push a massive pile of logs in totally the wrong place. Like, you just make a ton of work for yourself, or you just, it's kind of driving around's pretty easy. It's not actually difficult to drive these sort of things, but it is high stakes where it's like, if you hit something on accident, you're going to just totally gash it, so you just have to be pretty sort of cognizant of what's going on. Yeah, I didn't make any serious mistakes today. Mostly I'm just taking my time, but it's like, it's pretty incredible how fast people are who are good at it. It's like, it's not something you can just jump on and be good at right away. There's too many things to keep track of. Yeah. Anyway, hopefully you guys can come out and visit sometime, and you guys can fall some trees and drag them out of the woods with me.
I would bring back old memories, since I'm not sure which farm you're on, but I did that.
I'm on the Preem farm. I'm probably on the one that you worked on.
Yeah, long time ago. Yeah. Summer of 80, I don't know what it was. Summer 82 or 83. I'll have to go back and figure it out again, but just a few years ago. So, welcome, John, to the Resurrecting Civility podcast. I'm trying to remember that we are doing this live and that we're inviting other people into this conversation. At least right now, we're not really pushing that hard. We're just sort of dropping our discussions online so that people can catch up and we can ourselves keep track and have this this discussion of this in general, this pretty far-reaching project, have that discussion in public, and we push that conversation forward in one way on a couple of days a week, and in another way on the third day of the week. And that's middle, although it's the middle of the two. This is one of those open topic days. So with that by way of introduction, I'm wondering what's on your minds these days.
So we kind of talked about last night. The main thing going on right now is the abolish/defend or defund conversation in regards to the police.
Sure.
And it's kind of wild just to hear that kind of language. But I think delving into it a bit was really interesting to get people's perspectives. And for me, one big thing I noticed as I was looking at some different articles and podcasts was this guy, Alex Vitalis, I think, or Vitali. And this is a researcher who's been kind of talking about this subject and thinking about it for 30 years. And he came out with a book kind of recently about defunding the police or lessening the police presence in society. And so, yeah, I would definitely recommend looking more into that guy.
Is this guy at John Jay College by any chance, or is that somebody else? I heard somebody the other day who's a John Jay who's also in this space for a while, and I didn't know either of these gentlemen.
I don't think he was at John James.
Okay. Yeah, this guy that I'm thinking of is something like professor of policing, if there is such a thing. At John Jay College. That's the fellow I heard the other night. He made some sense. Also, it seemed like this is not a brand new subject. In fact, what I learned from that conversation, it's been done a couple times. A couple cities have done it in the U.S. I don't remember the names of either of them at the moment. They're not huge cities. They're probably South Bend size cities, or something like that.
Yeah.
With apparently mixed success. What is your guy Vitali? You say his name is?
Alex Vitalis, I think.
Vitalis. What's his take on all this, or his contribution, or how would you describe what you've heard?
He just talks about it. I mean, I obviously haven't listened to everything he said, but he just talks about it in a really like data-driven way. He talks about how, I mean, and what everyone has been talking about to some extent is, how it's useful to define what defund means and what abolish means and distinguish between the two. And right now, defund is kind of an unclear term. It could mean anything from just removing a couple programs from the police officers to defunding the whole program, which would be the same as abolishing it, basically. So defund is not a super clear word right now. But what the general consensus, it seems, is that a big problem with kind of linked to the healthcare system as well, in one sense, is right now we have a problem where we're not doing enough about prevention, and we're putting all of our resources into dealing with the problem when it comes up later in a worse off scenario. And yeah, similar with healthcare, prevention is could be a much more effective way at dealing with all of these social ills. And then another big point is that more and more jobs are being just pushed onto police that they weren't really ever trained or intended to deal with. Think like social problems like homelessness, mental illness, responding to drug overdoses. All of these social ills are now just shoved at the police, and they're told, here, deal with this. And they're not particularly good at it. So it's the defund movement, at least the most reasonable likely take that I looked at had to do with, at the very least, taking back some of these easily identifiable social ills and putting the people responding to those problems, taking that responsibility away from the police and giving it to more the community and social society at large. And with that, it would just mean a reallocation of resources from the police officers to these social programs. So all of that seems very reasonable to me. I think where it gets a lot more interesting is when you get people kind of wanting to continue the discussion about how far to defund and or abolish. Yeah, so I guess that's what I would start with.
Let me take a couple seconds to acknowledge that that's a topic we seem to be talking about. Defund, abolish policing. And when it's put up, that's exactly the wrong way to put it, it seems to me. I think there probably are some people who are in favor of abolishing policing, entirely.
Yeah.
Because there's not anything that you can't find somebody. Right?
Yeah. There's somebody saying
Thinks
it.
about them. And they're not crazy either when they.
Yeah, I wasn't sure. I didn't listen to enough. I haven't listened to enough of Vitali, but it seems like he might have a leaning towards abolishing it. I'm not clear on that, but he said some phrase like, "We don't really have any clue what that would look like." I think he said it would just be a process guided by a set of principles that we would work towards, not any actual declaration currently of how to do it right now, but just saying like that's something we want to move towards, basically.
Sure. Maybe
I mean,
go ahead, John.
well, it seems like one thing that would be helpful to clarify is when you say abolish the police, to distinguish that from abolishing law enforcement.
That's right.
Right. Because I think that's probably that's the first thing that occurs to me when you say abolish the police. So, I mean, I think it's me and John kind of talked about this last night, but it seems like a bad branding, politically bad branding, maybe. But
depends on who you're trying to.
That's true. That's
some
true.
ways it might be a good branding. You know what I mean? I wonder whether sometimes it's being used to brand it, to brand common sense as something which is a little less common sense, right?
Yeah.
To make people feel a lot better, right? Something's broken here. We're sure going to replace that.
Yeah.
We're not going to reform it. We're going to replace it. Well, yeah, you hear that expression sometimes used.
Yeah.
We're not just going to reform it. We're going to replace it. But,
Yeah. I mean, I think zooming out even from specifically police, like reform the police or abolish the police. I mean, I think that's a call for changing how we think about justice from a I think people think of the police as part of this retributive justice, like get retribution or enforce the law, make sure punish rule breakers of the law. It fits into this sort of punishment mindset. And my understanding is that the sort of academic term for that is retributive justice, as in retribution. And I think what people who have been thinking about this sort of on the more academic side are looking at more restorative justice models, as in, and I think restorative mostly on the side of people who have broken the law, right? How do you get them to actually re-enter society effectively? But I think I don't know this for sure, but it would make sense to me that prevention is also fitting into that restorative model where you're sort of getting at the causes more directly rather than, it seems like there's a prevention and restorative connection, and then there's a deterrent and punishment connection on the retributive side. So that's sort of what I was thinking about with regards to this topic, because I think that's maybe the more interesting and productive conversation than defund the police exactly. I think maybe not. Maybe not. I certainly think it's less polarizing to talk about things that way.
Yeah. I mean, we were talking about how abolish might be kind of a useful term to kind of brand it without really saying exactly what it means. But I even think defund is kind of that way as well, because typically when you defund something, I think it means like stop providing it with funds, not let's take some money away from this and give it to something else, which is much less catchy. But I think a lot of the people talking about defunding the police are
Sure.
meaning it that way.
Belt tightening.
Right.
Stay in force, right?
Yeah.
Let's make policing more efficient. That doesn't sound that doesn't have the same, this thing is broken and we have got to fix it, feel to it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's no question, certainly when you hear the rhetoric that comes out of Minneapolis, and I haven't heard it all, of course, nobody, at least you'd have to live there, and even then you wouldn't hear it all. But some of the city council members, in fact, I think the city council president, if I remember it correctly, is quite articulate, reasonably articulate about this. And I'm trying to remember precisely the language he uses, but it is very, I think it's fair to call it antagonistic. It's as if, look, it is definitely not reform. They do not want to reform. They think there's something here that's unreformable. There are structures that need to be torn down. And those structures are somehow at least part of what policing now is. This is me putting words into her mouth that I think I'm redescribing what I think she was saying. And so the police union, for example, is part of the structures inside policing that she would like to not reform. She thinks that is somehow entrenched, unreformable, and needs to be, the whole thing needs to be pulled down. And she doesn't mean that no law enforcement ought to happen. She does think that not every problem is a stick and you ought not to send the police. Something a number of people in this space respond to the question, well, what are you going to do when you call 911 and right, nobody answers? And sometimes the initial responses are, wait, we already have forks in 911, right? They send an ambulance if it's a health emergency, and they send a fire department if your house is on fire, right? They send the police if there's some sort of laws being broken, danger, other kinds of danger, right? Than those other two kinds. So we already make some distinctions here. What if we just had more services in there, right? There's somebody who's selling drugs. Okay, let's have a community intervention specialist go there, right? Let's bring already existing, hopefully, as you would bring community policing knowledge, this would sort of be community revitalization knowledge that's already woven, right? And you've already got professionals who are woven into the space. They understand the drug trafficking in this environment and its effect on the economy and all the folks who are involved, and they intervene differently. They don't intervene with a gun, and they don't intervene with the threat of law. They intervene with, hey, you know what? Let's get a meeting here. Let's get your parents in on this meeting. Let's get your pastor in on this meeting. Whatever resources we have, and so now that becomes fork in the road number 4. I need a better metaphor for forks in the road than forks in the road here. But when you call 911, you get appropriate responses. And these might be other families of appropriate response. And they replace a lot of what police themselves recognize. There's too much stuff being added to their plate, right? And so let's specialize and let's move our funding around in those spaces. But in order to do that, and that doesn't exactly sound like defunding. That doesn't sound that radical, right? That sounds like everybody could win, maybe, if that would be spending our social dollars more sensibly. But there's also this recognition that there are things standing in the way of that are written into what is now thought to be policing. And part of that is police unions. But maybe not all of that. There may also be law, right, written into that. And somehow that's got to be torn down. That's got to change because it's opposed to reform. either of you thought about schools when you thought about all this? Has the analogy with school takeover? Is that a conversation you've heard, or is it just an analogy in my own mind?
I'm not familiar with what you're talking about.
I'm talking about sometimes a city or a state even will take over an entire school district. If I remember correctly, the state of Michigan took over education from the city of Detroit. Something like that. That kind of thing happens. That's a big chunk of education to take over. Other times it's something smaller. It's just a school district. Other times it's pieces of a school district. So the state of Indiana will do that. And in fact, has done it in South Bend, right? Has basically said, you know what? You're spending money, state dollars in this place, and it's not working. And you guys just can't fix it. So we're going to fix it, right? We're going to come in and we're going to do something else. And all your rules, they're out the window. And we're going to bring in somebody else, and she's not subject to your teacher union contracts. And she's going to take over this thing. She's a turnaround specialist in a school, and she can hire anybody she wants. And she can dispense with all these regulations, and she can fix this because you guys can't fix this. We've sort of established that. Now that happened not uncommonly across the nation in education. And sometimes it goes together with, part of the problem are teachers' unions. Other times teachers' unions are part of the solutions here. I don't mean to paint them negatively. I have a lot of admiration for a lot of them, but there are also things where there are also problems that get entrenched. There are bad teachers and you can't get rid of them, bottom line. So sometimes people say that's part of the problem, and we've simply got to fix that. So we're going to come in, we're going to do something radically different. And teachers' union contracts are out. You no longer, we're not working with you anymore. You don't get to spend our money on your kids' education anymore because you can't spend it well, says the state. So we're going to spend it directly. We're going to bring in somebody else to spend it. That sounds a lot like abolishing teaching, abolishing education, not in the sense that we're not in favor of education, but in the sense that we think there's institutional inertia, and we've got to break it, and we're going to break it.
How well has that worked historically?
That's a good question, and you need to be more expert at it than I am. I think in general,
but it still is. It seems that there's a different attitude with respect to outcomes in education and policing. I mean, that's the fundamental issue, right? I mean, what are the outcome standards that we're looking for with regards to law enforcement, right, and policing? I mean, right? I mean, these are the questions. I mean, we want as few people in prison as possible, it seems to me, right? I mean, I haven't seen anyone. I haven't seen a list laid out. Maybe I just haven't read enough yet, but I'm sure people are talking about this. I mean, what are the outcomes we're looking for, right? And how can we move toward them, right? Because I mean, I agree with everything you're saying the whole time. I mean, I think it makes clearly things aren't working, right? So what does it look like when things are working, and how can we bring in someone to make the reforms that we need to get the outcomes where we want them to be?
No, that's good.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think also the stakes would be a lot higher if someone did something similar with the police that they did with education. Like if crime rates go up massively after the state comes in and changes everything, or something goes way worse. I mean, messing up education is also pretty high stakes, but it's not as immediately apparent. So people might be more hesitant to let an outside agent come in and dictate.
They might. Of course, part of whether crime rates go up or not is let's see, it's not like there's such a thing as crime that's off the table, some independent entity. There are death rates. I'll grant you that, right? Reminds me of the coronavirus discussion here. There are death rates, and those are pretty easy to pick up. And as long as you measure with any kind of honesty, you're going to get death rates. But crime, not so, because you can change the law with regard to crime, and you can change the level of enforcement with regard to crime, right? So do crime rates go up? Well, it kind of depends on what you look for, right?
Yeah.
If you have a broken windows policy in place, right, and somebody jaywalks, somebody steps foot in the street when the lights are not right, and you call that a crime and you arrest them, right, then crime rates are now up.
Right.
And if you scare the life out of people so they don't do any of that ever, then crime rates are back down. But those are crime rates because you made them crime rates. You could just lighten up a little bit, right? Let people figure it out themselves about how to cross the street.
Yeah, one example that I've heard about for a long time, but I just saw brought up again in this context was Portugal legalizing drugs basically across the board, everything or at least in personal amounts. If you have above a certain limit, you're considered a dealer, and then you're still treated as a criminal. But below a certain threshold, you can have any drug, and you don't go to jail for it. So that allowed Portugal to treat it as a medical or mental illness problem or drug problem, whatever you want to call it. And apparently the results seem to be at least from a lot of people's perspective, that it was an overwhelming success. Like death rates from drug overdoses are down, like all of the metrics that we're looking for were a success on that front. So I think that's one of the examples that's being pointed to and as a way or version of this that has already found success.
That's good. So maybe that's part of the policing discussion has got to be the legal discussion. I mean, what you police, after all, I take it, are the laws.
Right.
You intervene when there's some contravention of law.
Yeah.
So, and you could very well have, and you might argue that we do have a militaristic, a pretty oppressive regime in that regard. And how do you know? One metric, JP, you pointed to earlier, is how many people are in jail, right? Yeah. So how many people are in jail in the United States? Anybody know the number? It might be worth Googling. I'm going to guess it's in the low millions of people that are in jail in the United States.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm going to guess, when I say guess, these are, yeah.
I'm not sure.
My guess is people of color make up the majority of that population.
Yeah, probably.
Both of those things I think are true, although, yeah. And I think we might be, again, I'm going to use a conservative figure. If I were a betting man, betting on my memory here, I'm going to bet that we have twice the incarceration rate, at least, of any other sizable nation in the world. Twice the incarceration rate per population.
Yeah, I would say probably 5 times that of other developed democracies.
The first data I'm seeing is 2016, 2.3 million incarcerated.
2.3, okay.
And in 2008, we had 24% of the world's prisoners. So I don't know what a more updated statistic would be.
24% of the world's prisoners, we could put that average on pretty easily, because we've got, give us 300 million in, call it 9 billion rather, right? If that's the case, we're 127th, right, of the world's population. So we ought to have about 4%. I'm really bad numbers here, right? We ought to have somewhere around 4%. And instead we've got 24%.
Yeah. Yeah. 6 times as many as we ought to have.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And probably a bunch of those were in multiple times, you know?
Yeah.
You know, it's not their first time.
That's right. That's another
in
rate.
and out.
Recidivism rate. It'd be fun to track that across.
Yeah.
Fun's the word here, but yeah.
So we got kind of a interesting thing that's come up for me in this is like, how much is this a unique problem of the police, and how much is this just police having to enforce and just do so many different things that they're not equipped to do?
Yeah. Maybe it's a problem with lawmakers. Maybe that's where we ought to be. Maybe we ought
Laws,
to be funding lawmakers.
Courts, and
whatever that means.
And police officers are just downstream of all that.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Still, it's one thing to arrest a guy from counterfeiting, which is a law. It's another thing to kneel on him for 9 minutes.
Yeah. Right.
So there are some separate issues here. They seem to be separate issues.
Yeah, it's much easier to identify when a police officer does a horrible job than when lawmakers do a horrible job.
Yeah, maybe so.
Yeah.
Maybe lawmakers do a horrible job when you see that we have 24% of the world's prisoners in our jails. In other words, when we've let our society drift in a penitentiary way, we need other words for this. I don't know what the right words are. We are a police state, right? In that regard. Kind of a militaristic state, right? We are going to inflict stuff on you do not want to have happen to you unless you obey all our laws.
Yeah. Yeah. And we're going to particularly enforce those laws on communities that have faced historical discrimination.
Right. That doesn't sound like the right design, does it?
I mean,
that does seem like what we got.
Yeah.
If not by design, we're there. A good question how we got there. It might be design. There are people who say it's by design.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It certainly used to be by design, and that's not up for debate at all. I mean, no one would fight you on the fact that we used to, you know, that our institutions were overtly racist, right? And it seems that even the issue now is, even if it's not obvious that even if racism isn't written into the laws super explicitly, there definitely is just clearly there's just creep. There's just residual effects that we haven't corrected for. I mean, I haven't heard of any particular, you know, like we don't have any like segregation laws anymore necessarily, right? That's what I mean by just overtly racist. But I don't know. There needs to be a way to correct for the situation, which clearly is discriminatory, and there needs to be a more sophisticated discussion about it and a more outcomes based discussion, I think, because the results speak for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
You know.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable.
Yeah.
This whole set of demonstrations is pretty remarkable.
Yeah.
It reminds you a lot. Well, it reminds me a lot because I'm old enough to remember, and you'll have to resort to news clips of the fall of the Berlin Wall. But I can tell you that seemed almost to come out of nowhere. That not attention to the Berlin Wall, and not various efforts to bring it down. Ronald Reagan in a famous speech, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall.
Yeah.
There was a lot of that kind of hammering at it. But and I don't know the story well enough, even though I was sort of paying attention. I was paying attention like just a regular dude who followed the news about exciting events and not really diving into the root causes with much care. But the question is, what is it that triggered the change? Why did we go from long time wishing that wall would come down to it just lit on fire. It was explosive, and practically nobody saw it coming. That's almost certainly false because it's way out there on the extreme. But put it this way, you could go a long way and talk to a lot of people and hear a lot of people, including a lot of experts, who didn't say that they saw it coming. They didn't seem to see it coming. More in our lifetime is Arab Spring. I'm trying to remember what year was that. Was that 2014 maybe? Am I right about that year? It was roughly like that. But that also was, the people might have planned it. People might have worked really hard to incite things, and they might have sort of seen something coming, but it's hard to know how the tipping point was reached so clearly. And the whole thing just lights up, and that's what happened across the Middle East and during those months of what's been called the Arab Spring. And out of nowhere, and who in the United States sort of expected this to happen? That there would be demonstrations, of course, that there would be other mistreatments of minorities at the hands of police, no brainer. That people are going to die, of course, right? Sooner or later. That was all totally predictable. But isn't there something bigger than this? Is it all coronavirus? Is that what it did? Is that what did it? Or is there something else at work?
Yeah. Hard to say. There's a lot going on. Certainly it certainly seems like the coronavirus certainly was a factor in it. I mean,
might have been, but you might have
seems
thought
like we've been
was a depressing factor, an incredible depressive factor that didn't in fact depress it.
Right.
All it did is get people to mask up.
Yeah.
Even in New York City, right, where they had gone through, nowhere more clearly in the entire world had they gone through, except perhaps in Italy, right, or such a very clear effort to turn a very difficult outbreak back. And they seem, from all measurements reported, to have done a great job doing that. And then all of a sudden, boom, the lid breaks off.
Yeah. I'm not sure it's obvious that it was a depressing factor. That's not obvious to me. I think you could make an argument that it was a energizing factor, given the people weren't working, people were home. It had been months of people cooped up in their houses, and more people were probably paying attention to the news. I mean, that's probably the main thing. I mean, I think that's the big thing. I mean, everyone was everyone was tuned in. I mean, there's nothing else to do. I mean, it's like I was reading the news all the time. I mean, I read the news more during coronavirus than any other time. And you have the disparity, and I mean, clearly the African American community was getting hit by this virus harder than any other community. So you had that, and then I think there's also, I mean, and that was all over the New York Times in April, right? In May.
Yes, that's right.
And then you have everyone paying attention to the news, and then this heinous video gets out. I mean, that is just, it is so horrible.
Mm-hmm.
And people take to the, I mean, it's, in some ways it's like, it's
and it was a double whammy too. I think Breonna Taylor was her name. The police, the no-knock raid, and killed her. So I mean, it was a double horrifying police.
Yeah, and then the Aubrey one was just
in Georgia.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, come on, Southern Georgia, you got these white vigilantes chasing down a jogger. It's like, I mean,
or whatever it is. Whatever it was, because there's various stories that he stopped by a construction zone. People thought he was a crime risk. I don't know if there's I don't know, and I don't care. The point is, you got these vigilantes out who killed a guy for doing nothing. Right. And they killed the guy because they brought a gun to a gunfight.
Yep.
Right. That they had no business being in the first place.
Yep. Yep. And then you just got the buildup of really since Ferguson. Right. I mean, or Ferguson, and what was the first really big one where there were protests about things like this? Was it New
York City? New York City was
Eric
first before Ferguson. Not much with it, and then there was Freddie Gray in Philadelphia. I think was also before Ferguson. Am I right, or is it after? It was not. It's in the series anyway.
Yeah.
Right.
And then was it Trayvon Martin down in
earlier still
down in Florida? Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Where was he with George Zimmerman or whatever that guy's name was?
Yeah, that's right. Maybe in Pensacola. Is that right?
Yeah, that sounds.
The city
sounds close.
In Florida.
Yeah. But the point is we've just had, it's just data points and have been building. I mean, it's just. But it's pretty clear that things need to change, and I don't, there's just a willingness to overlook outcomes that we would care about. Like that's what's so brutal about, that's what's so frustrating about this discussion, is just like, oh, they broke the law, criminals break the law, send them to jail. They like, it's like you're just there's just a total wall of just not actually caring about things that you ought to care about, it seems to me. It just doesn't seem like, this conversation, this should be that hard of a thing. I just.
Why do you think it is?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't want to derail us too far. We could put a pin in that question if we want, and stay on sort of the details of the current.
Yeah. Why do I think that is? Well, I think inertia, I mean, is one answer. I mean, there's the,
You mean just the institutional?
Yeah.
Institutional racism just keeps running.
Yeah.
just doesn't get fixed because that's the way it is.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah. Something like that. I mean, I think you see something similar. This is, yeah, I think the institutional racism is there, and it's people don't want to change it, and I think it's also this sort of I think people are too, they're sort of I think it really is an issue of people put too much emphasis on personal responsibility for people, where because I think of the Conservative Party as really the party of personal responsibility. I mean, that's the sort of value. It's like people are going to be held responsible for what they do, right? And they get their desserts for how they act in the world. And yeah, the Black community, well, guess what? They just commit more violent crime. Bang, they get their just desserts, right? And I think that's just a heinously uncompassionate and unhelpful way to actually think about the problems. And it's also just dishonest, I think.
What do you do
just,
though, Tom? What? Maybe I should let you finish, but I want to before we lose this nice line of thought you're building, I want to ask you about people who address that very line of thought from a very different perspective. And I have particularly in mind African Americans who address it from a different perspective. And here I heard Shelby Steele the other day, just to name one. But there's lots of others. And there's a whole group called the 1776 Project, which I take it as something like a foil to the 1619 project, which I have not. I know there's a blog named 1619. Is that John Rose? You're up on these things. Am I right? When people say 1619, are they talking about the podcast series, or are they talking about something richer than that?
It was a whole large project put on by the New York Times.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
That had a pretty large scope. Yeah.
What's the relationship between that podcast? That's what I don't know, and what the Times published.
Yeah, I haven't listened to the podcast. I assumed it was just a New York Times continuation of the discussion, but I've not listened to it. So.
Right. Okay. Well, I've got to catch up. But in response to that, there's a 1776 project, which is a lot of African American voices who take a very different approach. I would never get it right, but it's something like, well, of course, there's these terrible history of racism, but you can victimize, you can run to victimhood, right? Or you can take responsibility for your own lives. And when people do that, it works better. That's a bumper sticker caricature really, of the 1776 response to the 1699 project, such as I've heard from the 1776. And I've listened a whole hour of, maybe even a little less than an hour, of people sort of coming out and speaking for about 5 minutes, one after another, saying, yeah, I'm in this project. I'm behind this. I also don't think that we're actually victims, or that it helps us. Not that bad things have ever been done or continue to be done, or that they're reprehensible. It's just that we don't need, and we should not victimize ourselves. We should fix our own problems, starting in our own backyard. And we should not wait for the majority to have a change of heart. In fact, we didn't used to do that, sometimes people will say, and things went way better for us, even though the oppression was way worse on us. We built our own businesses. We parented our own families. We did all sorts of different things that worked better for us and that have now been lost. That's sort of how that line of thought runs. So it's not denying the points you made, JP. And I should hand it back to you and let you make those points again. But, and maybe comment on the victimization, the victimhood complex that that some of all kinds, of all parties in this dispute, you'll find some think that that's actually a significant concern.
Yeah. Let's see. I think, let's see. I'm not, I think there's a way to think about that on two different levels, which is, do you actually want, is it good? Do I think it's good for people to think about them on an individual level, to conceive of themselves as victims? Do I think, it seems to me that that would be not, I don't think that's what people want, right? I don't think that would be good. And I don't think, I think that's what I think people are getting at in that, with what you're describing there, is like, I don't think it's good for people to just conceive of themselves as victims and want to have everything done for them. But I don't think that that's, I don't know. Yeah, let's see. I think you can avoid, let's see, I'm losing my train of thought here. So what does it mean for that to, it used to be better, or it would be better if people just took personal responsibility for things? Or how would you actually talk about that, right? I mean, just because like more freedom and more personal responsibility is in itself better, like just because that's how we decided, if people do that, it's better. How would you decide it's better? It seems like you'd have to look at some sort of outcomes, right?
Sure.
So, I mean, I guess then the discussion is what we're doing right now. It seems like right now we're telling them that they have to take responsibility for themselves, or we're going to put them in jail, or they're going to break the law. We're going to put them in jail, right? People always have responsibility for themselves in some extent, and they always could, like, that avenue is always open, right? No, I don't think anyone's closing that door on anyone, right? But there clearly our outcomes are bad, right? And in terms of our incarceration rate and our education in these minority communities, and health in these minority communities, we have our outcomes are really bad. And so I think you can have an honest discussion about outcomes and different ways that we could improve outcomes without victimizing everyone in those communities and making them victims, or giving them a victim mindset. I think you can do both of those things at the same time.
Here's where we had Jordan Peterson in the conversation. He might have some things to say. This is my impression. I wonder if either of you have that impression. Maybe we've heard different takes from him. But I think he's very, very strong on personal responsibility.
Yeah.
As a bigger deal than we make it. I think maybe that's part of how he, you guys both know his work better than I do, his career. But where I first picked him up was where he hit flat on campus about political, about right speech, and making certain kinds of speech illegal, or if not illegal, contrary to policy on college campuses, et cetera. And he when I first heard him, I thought he was kind of tin-eared on that, in the sense that, well, the things that he was saying is right, but it's as if he didn't understand these other people. That was my impression. He didn't understand where these folks are coming from. It's like he didn't give a shit about them. I've since learned that that's false. He does care about them, I think. He really does. And he's not without understanding. So something else is going on there. And I think it has more to do, very simple picture, but has more to do with the fact that he really thinks that it's very bad to cater to people's sense of entitlement. That's just not how you raise kids in the playground. You'll end up with a bunch of kids who don't know how to play with the other kids. Suck it up, kid. Right? Somebody pushed you in line. You can go run. You can talk to mom. You can change the rules of the neighborhood, etc. You can do all kinds of stuff. You can have helicopter parents police all your games, to really shift the analogy a little bit. But what they really ought to do, get out of the playground and let their kids duke it out a little bit. That's what kids do. And if you don't do that, you deprive them of their ability to grow in the ways that kids need to grow in terms of sticking up for themselves, and sometimes sticking up for one another, but not by some great big top-down fix where nobody gets oppressed anymore, right? Where you just, when the bully hits you, you dry your eyes and you get up, and maybe a couple of you stick up for one another the next time. And no one fixes it. It's just the way it is. I think he's more like that, from what I've heard of him. And so this is where I think that perspective might come to bear here. Of course, these are not playground offenses we're talking about. And I don't mean to trivialize people being killed at the hands of police, or terrorized at the hands of police, or turned into felons with no economic escape, practically, from the time they're teenagers, very young teens, right? The very activities which they've got to engage in order to survive and be included with other people are going to land them in trouble with the law, going to keep them from being employed, going to keep them from voting, going to keep them from all kinds of things. That is awful. And that, it seems to me, is real. But the question still remains, who should change that? And you could wait for the state legislators to change it, or you could basically force them to change it.
What do you mean force them to change?
If you can't force them, one way to take responsibility for yourself is to, it's a good question what I mean by that. If you turn that very hard, you can turn that to violent action. And that has been one sort of, we're going to take responsibility for ourselves. If you guys have ever seen the Summer of Freedom, it's a PBS documentary special, and it ought to be celebrated from the rooftops on this subject. Summer of Freedom. And it's about the origin of the Mississippi Democratic Freedom Party, if I'm remembering my language right. And this was in the state of Mississippi, where African Americans were systematically, everything that could possibly be done to keep them from registering from voting, and voting was being done. And so they created another party. They took action, created another party, the Mississippi Democratic Freedom Party. It's been a number of years since I've watched this, and I'm no historian, so I highly recommend watching it. It's utterly engaging. Yeah. My recollection from the story is that this other party showed up, had gathered a lot of momentum, and showed up at the 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago, and had enough I don't remember precisely, not at all. So I'm going to make up the story from here on. The following is fiction, okay? But this fiction conveys the feeling that the actual events conveyed to me, okay? So with that caveat, here's how it went fictitiously in Chicago. Some very important legislation depended, very important. There might have been rules, it might have been candidates, might have been policies and platforms. Don't remember those details. Let's imagine it was all three, because this is fiction, right? A lot of those things were at risk, right? The very stuff that people gather in conventions for, the very stuff that people with power pay a lot of attention to. And some significant subset of that was at risk because this party was there. And so the powers that be said, okay, let's have a meeting, all you guys, because we're not in agreement with you all, and you all are here trying to get in, and we're sort of keeping you out, and there's a lot of stuff at stake. So we're going to have a meeting with you. We're going to have a truce, and we're going to have a meeting. It's going to be off-site, and I'm going to go. I'm Hubert Humphrey, and that part I'm trying to remember. I'm going to go, and I'm going to meet with you guys. And so they do. And they have a good meeting, and everybody comes out of that meeting okay. What they don't tell you is, what they don't tell anybody at that meeting is they grabbed some rule and took advantage of some rule, and they fixed all the issues without any of these people having a word to say about it. While they were feigning parlay, they absolutely undercut their entire movement and disenfranchised them once again. Disenfranchised this enfranchisement movement. Okay. It was at that point, the story runs, that this is where, if I may have, again, this is fiction, my memory, call it fiction, okay? But this is something like the story. This is where, for example, Black Panthers just grew an enormous amount of power. We are no longer going to work with that broken, lying system, right? We're going to take things into our own hands, and we are going to disobey. We are going to take what is rightfully ours. You can't, no one's going to give you power. You have to take it. Okay. So that's one line. That's one direction in answer to your question. What did I mean? When you say people need to take responsibility for themselves, they might take it that way.
That's what you mean by force.
They might take it by force. Now that could be done in all kinds of violent ways, or it can be done. I mean, Gandhi in effect did that in India, right? Gandhi has this huge nonviolent movement, and Martin Luther King did it in the United States in another way, preaching nonviolence, but going after the very teeth of the problem, right? And putting their marches precisely in the place where the problem was worst, so that they would have the largest backlash, so that they would generate the largest amount of light on the problem, and unite people around fixing that problem. So that was a fight. That was force, right? But it was sort of non-violent force, right? It was political force. It was civil force. But no mistake about it. It was force. And a lot of people had to give up stuff because they simply couldn't win. They had to change. Same thing in India with Gandhi, I think. Right. So whether it's on the violent side or on the political action side, both of those things, and I think you see both of those demonstrated in current
So
life. Right
so
now.
connect that, Uncle Tom, connect that back for me to what you were saying about Jordan Peterson versus and the 1776 project.
Yeah. Sure. Let me say one more tiny thing about it. Those are changing the rules. Those are two ways, violent and nonviolent, for changing policy at a big scale. Okay. You could also just imagine taking responsibility for your own social life, right? And raising your own kids and building your own companies, right? And basically building your own economy and saying, we're getting no help from you guys, right? We're not asking for help from you guys. We're going to do it ourselves. Try and stop us, right? That's sort of an internal version. You might do it in an angry way, or you might do it in a peaceful way, but that also, I think, is taking responsibility inside your own streets. You can imagine policing your own streets. And when kids break the law, you catch them yourself, right? You police them yourself. Those are two different sorts of things. And now, so those are two directions, right? In which, if you were an advocate for taking responsibility, whether it's for laws that inflict you or big institutional policies that inflict, or just patterns of cultural life, right? Instead of blaming those patterns of cultural life on the fact that, these boys didn't have a father because their fathers were in jail. That's right. Quit complaining about it. And let's fix the fatherhood problem. And there are people who talk that way.
Yeah.
Right? And they say, I'm not interested in your help fixing it. Well, you don't know anything about it anyway. Or that's the most extreme version of that. So you could imagine people who are like that. And the concern is from some, and I'm answering your last question, from, say, folks from the 1776 sort of movement, or from what I heard of Shelby Steele. I haven't written his book. I didn't write his book, of course. I haven't even read it. But White Guilt, I think, is the name of it. Or that's a concept in it, if that's not the title. And the point is that those kinds of activities are more effective. Those kinds of activities are essential. And things that water down those kinds of activities, as if, no, we've got to convince the whole majority of the population to do things our way, right? After all, they owe it to us if they're right thinking. So let's tell them about institutional racism and how bad that's been, right? And see if we can fix everybody and get everybody to fix these problems. That's not the wisest course. That's not what actually works. And if you wait for that to happen, you're going to wait in vain. And in a certain sense, I've heard Shelby Steele say something like this. That is in a certain sense to victimize people all over again. It's to say, we need the white people to come and fix this problem for us. We can't fix it for ourselves. And I think Shelby Steele's attitude is more like bullshit. Stand up and fix it for yourself. That's what people do. And people have done it before when racism was worse. Without saying racism isn't real, without saying racism shouldn't be identified, it shouldn't be the fixation. It shouldn't be the focus of people who are in a bad way. That's, I think, what that line is. And that's what I was inviting you to comment on. So psychologically, it's better for you in terms of social responsibility. Maybe that's sort of a Jordan Peterson approach. Socially, it's more effective if you take those sorts of actions. That's sort of a historical, there are African-American historians who will tell that kind of story. Yeah. And that, I think, complexifies it a little bit. It makes it less clear what to do.
Well, I mean, I think it does. I'm not sure it really does. I don't find that really muddies the issue too much, because I think, I mean, in some ways, I think there's reason to think that that's correct on an individual basis, right? I mean, this is what this is what I was trying to say before, and maybe but I think it is best for people if they, because basically what you're saying is I'm in a situation, or what those people are saying is you're in a situation, that's your situation, do the best you can in that situation and make the best of it, right? And take as much responsibility as you possibly can, right? And don't, like, be productive. Don't just sit around, right? It's like,
Neighbors,
those are just like, those are just obvious. It's like, yeah, but at the same time, there is this issue of we do have systemic issues, and those are the types of things that people protest about, where we have these systemic issues of racism, and they manifest in these incarceration rates, in the destruction of family units in the Black community by incarcerating all the young men, right? And it exacerbates. It's just there's just clearly something that could be done better on a structural level as well. And tons of resources are going into putting people in jail, right? It's like the money's already being spent, right? We're throwing tons of money at our crime problems, our quote unquote crime problems, right? For what purpose, right? What outcomes do we actually want from that, right? I think you can have both of those discussions at the same time and it actually not really muddy the issue, right? We want our societies to function well, and you can have a conversation on a macro scale and on a personal scale.
So you're saying it's crystal clear what to do, just on all these. You got to attack it on all these fronts. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but it's not a clarity problem, right? It's just, of course, there's a lot of fronts here.
Yeah,
and
I think those
on a lot of levels.
But I don't think that those two ideas are actually in collision. Have to be. I don't think they're opposing. I think that's a false opposition. Mm-hmm. And that those people don't actually really need to argue or not cooperate or collaborate with one another.
Yeah. Wouldn't the argument be that, like, the example for personal responsibility that you were talking about was like Martin Luther King and the Black Panther Party? That was a version of like larger social responsibility, right?
Yes.
So yeah, why is that different than the current social movement? The narrative might be a bit different about who to blame, but it's all these people getting up and trying to change laws and protests. What's the difference this time around?
Right. So maybe I ran quickly over, especially Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement. The reason I brought him in was to say that there are 9 nonviolent uses of force. There are nonviolent manifestations of force. I think that's true. And I brought him in for that purpose. Yeah, it's interesting. I should know King better than I know him. My impression of King was not so much focused on what's wrong, not so much with historical grievances as a vision that we fall short of and need not, right? And holding up a strong vision of, the "I have a dream" speech captures it, and maybe it's not fair to read him through that lens primarily, and I don't know, but that's right. That certainly is a piece of it. It could be like this. It should be like this. These are our founding documents, point to this very thing, right? And we've got this original sin of racism. Oops, how about just we fell short, deeply fell short, right, as a nation, and we can and should fix that, right? As opposed to really focusing on the sin and the guilt, right? And the responsibility and whose responsibility is for it, and how far short we fall, and who and where that responsibility lies. You could focus on that, and it might be true, right? But it might be less helpful if you focus on that. Whereas you might just, it's one thing to focus on this ideal we want to work toward together. And you'll take anybody who wants to come and work for it with you.
And so was the narrative that either John was presenting or the narrative as a whole right now, you think it is in contrast to that, where it does?
I'm representing here a set of voices which do think. And, and I don't know enough about it myself to know what I think about it, to be honest with you. I know what my instincts are, but I've learned not to trust them until I know more. So my instincts are to resist these voices, not that they don't have legitimate perspectives. They do have legitimate perspectives, but what I haven't seen is a deep understanding. Let's see. I think people make real contributions when they deeply
Which
understand
voices?
The 1776 voices, and I was sort of speaking on their behalf, right, in this conversation recently,
right,
doing my best. There's only three of us, so right, doing my best to bring them into the conversation and ask what you might think, right? Particularly John, JP, I asked you, what would you, how do you respond? And it seemed to me you responded quite clearly, right, to them, which is, sure, there might be something to what you say, but then join the fight, right? Or this is one way I took you. There's no false opposition here. There is a false opposition here. There is no real opposition here, right? Get to work. It may very well be that people ought to recognize racism in all kinds of ways, institutional racism, and we ought to go after it, and we ought to clean the deck of it wherever we can find it. We ought to do that, and right, to both and, right, and we ought to take responsibility, and we ought to, right, we ought to have an analysis, we ought to have a plan of action, we ought to collaborate, we ought to stand up, we ought to get the job done ourselves with our neighbors, right, and start there. And stop waiting for the Marshall Plan or something else to fly in and save us, even while we engage in these other sorts of activities, some of us, right, at these higher sort of broader educational, broader political, broader legal levels.
Do we think that would be?
That seems right to me, actually.
That would be something that the 1776 movement or people, whoever it was, would that be something that they would buy?
That's a good question. I'd love to put that question to them.
I think they would have a different perspective of how the current movement is going, I think.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what, I'll send you a link to the 1776 launch series of talks. My impression, to be honest with you, and I hate to criticize people before I know them well. I think it's a big mistake, and I give into it too. But I did hear what sounded to me like a bunch of ad hominem arguments and setting up straw man in argument, where other positions were caricatured, not characterized, and not characterized with rich understanding. And that might just be a function of, a little bit of initial time crunch, and everybody makes those mistakes, if they are mistakes anyway. And it doesn't mean that there's no real rich understanding and no rich sympathetic investigation of other people's points of view. But I didn't see it. That's all I'm saying in their launch. That's not what they were leading with. they were leading with the opposite. They were leading with these guys don't know their ass from their elbow. Nobody put it that way, but I'd say, I think that's a fair characterization of the 1619 movement from the voices from the overall story told at the 1776 movement. That these guys are part of the problem for African Americans, no part of the solution, or very little part of generally not part of the solution, part of the problem. That I suspect that that's not enough said. not from my limited understanding and my deep dive.
It's easy to imagine that being the case. Seems like that's probably what it would be. You there, John? Looks like Uncle Tom froze.
Tiny little deep dive. I mean, it's more like story after story after story, and start to care for them, and start to hear how they care for one another, and start to feel what the impact is of various kinds of forces on their lives. Seems to me it's not until you dive into that you're really in a position to understand or be very critical. I think criticism is premature until you get there. And I didn't see that. And it's for me, it's not enough that these are all, the race does not cut it for me, right? You get all kinds of, look, how many white people are on different sides of this issue, on every issue, right? You have all kinds of different folks, and you don't get, the color of your skin does not give you an automatic ticket. It does give you the experience of being, it gives you a certain kind of experience which is different. But there's not a single Black experience. That's, I think, obvious. There's no single white experience either. So anyway, I'm no longer sure what I'm rambling on about. What do I think of 1776? I'll send it to you and you can take a look at it.
Sure.
And meanwhile, I'll dive into the 1619 podcasts. I think there are 6 or 7 podcasts deep now or something like that. It's not endless. It won't be endless to try to at least get a clue as to where they are. So.
Yeah, that's the New York Times continuation of their project. The podcast is so.
Yep. Well, I don't know if we hit the racism issue a little hard. I don't know if we've hit the policing issue as hard as we might have wanted to. They're not unconnected.
Right.
Yeah.
Any last thoughts from either of you?
Well, I think, I don't know. I guess my last thought is, I think you can. I think there's a serious. I think there is a real false opposition going on in our culture between people who are concerned about outcomes, and people who are concerned about personal responsibility. And I think that there's, I think that those people could work together better than they do. And I think, I think it's crippling in a lot of ways, that false opposition. But yeah, I guess that's my final thought. I wish people cared more about actually improving outcomes, and taking that seriously, and taking a frank look at the data and actually understanding what's going on. And I wish that, people also develop psychologically healthy ways of being in the world with regards to, doing the best, like making the most of their lives. I don't know. Yeah. my final thought.
Yeah. Good. JR?
I think the defund the police discussion is just getting started in society. I saw like a Google Trends thing, and it in the last like 8 days, the line is just straight up. And I heard someone on one podcast talking about it and how they're basically saying like we don't have all the answers to all the specifics right now, but we're kind of just interested in starting the conversation. And so I hope that people don't jump to one side of the issue too quickly, because I think I don't really know if the people calling for abolition or defunding really even know what they're suggesting quite yet, at least in the specifics. So I think to jump into absolute opposition to it would not be right. So yeah, I'm just interested in seeing where the discussion goes moving forward on it.
Nice. Two good closing perspectives. This is one of the nights that we can actually come close to 90 minutes and put a period down. And, let's try that.
Nice.
Yeah, let's try. John Rose, first, I got to thank both of you in different respects. My last thoughts for podcasting contributions. First, the app, the link that you sent, JP. By the way, played the whole of Sam Harris's conversation.
Okay.
The whole 3 hours. The link apparently that you get is a subscriber link. Yeah. And I don't know if that's a flaw in their system. He doesn't care. I don't know. And, you know, I'll try and do him justice one of these days. But in the meantime, I listened to that whole conversation, right? Which was really quite rich. We'll talk about that conversation another time. Totally different topic. But thanks for that. And thanks for the app that hosts it. And I think, John Rose, I forget exactly what you said, but whether it was about that app or about apps in general in this space. And I hadn't approached podcasting from this point of view. I never had a podcasting app prior to this. It's either on YouTube or I don't listen to it, almost without exception. Or someone sends me a link and I chase it. So there's probably been 100 of those too, but no systematic approach to that. So I sort of tried to emulate both of you guys, and I took a pretty deep dive and did some searching and came up with a dozen or so podcasts that I'm subscribing to in one space. This is in addition to I get a very lively feed already from YouTube. YouTube functions in a similar kind of way. If you have things there. But anyway, this is it showed me a lot of things I hadn't seen. It's more of I think I knew it was a pretty darn organized world that I had never stepped foot in. I think I knew enough to know that. But anyway, I've put my foot in it just a little bit, and it's already been helpful. So thank you.
All right, nice.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, well, if you find any great podcasts, please share them.
I will. Now, one thing I haven't paid attention to, there's got to be a sharing dimension of that, right? You've got to be in that. Can I share to individual members inside that podcasting app, the one you use, JR? JP.
I actually just got that app a couple weeks ago myself.
Okay. Gotcha.
So I'm actually not super familiar with that app. I know I can share stuff the way I shared it with you.
Right.
And I know I can subscribe and bookmark and auto download, but I haven't made many social connections through the app itself.
I get it. Yeah. It'd be nice if you could sort of drag something over to your favorites or something like that with your favorite people.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like shared Spotify playlist, but for podcast.
Yeah, like a shared Spotify playlist. Yeah.
Yeah, that would be cool.
So we'll have to keep an eye out. I'm sure that exists now that we're anything that looks remotely useful, I've learned this years ago, already exists and it's free. I mean, those are the the chances of you inventing anything, unless it is absolutely your specialty, you're not the first person to think of it.
That's almost certainly the case.
I actually once put a little app together to test that with a little Google form together and tried to get people to, try it. Think of anything you wish the internet could do for you. Anything. It can already do that for you, and it's already free. If you can write the algorithm in your head, somebody's already coded it, and it's already commercialized in a freemium format. That's a very good rule of thumb.
Yeah.
Try it sometime just for fun. I mean, in some strange area, and unless you're, way out on a lunatic fringe, of specialization, you're not the first person to think of it. Of course, it would be useful. So that's why you can use it. Anyway, cool stuff. Fun.
Yeah.
All right, guys, I'll see you Friday, and it's great talking with you.
Great talking to you guys.
Sounds good.
But I'll send you in follow up. I'll send you at least that 1776 deal, and I'm going to do that before I get out of this chair.
Okay, cool.
Right.
Great.
See you soon.
See you guys.